Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels on Communism by Paresh Chattopadhyay. The Oxford Handbook of the History of Communism, edited by Stephen A. Smith. Introduction. The representation of communism as an ideal society is at least as old as Plato. It was Marx and Engels who made communism famous as the projection of a society that could arise logically out of the internal contradictions of capitalism itself, and as the outcome of a self-emancipatory proletarian revolution. They of course drew on the writings of their great predecessors, mainly Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, the Utopians, who had propagated the ideas of a post-capitalist society at a time when the working class movement and the material conditions for the emancipation of the working class were underdeveloped. Communism appears in two different senses in the works of Marx and Engels. In the first sense, it is as a theoretical expression. As Engels succinctly states, quote, "To the extent that communism, is theoretical, it is the theoretical expression of the place of the proletariat in the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the summation of the conditions of the emancipation of the proletariat," end quote, Engels. Shortly thereafter, in 1848, the Communist Manifesto echoed this. Quote, "The theoretical principles of the communists are only the general expressions of the real relations of the existing class struggle, of a historical movement that is going on before our eyes," end quote, Marx and Engels. In the second sense, communism refers to the society which is envisaged as arising from the demise of capital. Quote, "The real movement which abolishes the present state of things," end quote, inaugurates a communist society which is also designated by Marx alternatively and equivalently as, quote, "socialism," and, quote, "the reunion of free individuals," end quote, the, quote, "Republic of Labor," end quote, the cooperative society, the, quote, "society of free and associated producers," or simply and frequently the, quote, "association," a shortened version of the, quote, "associated mode of production," end quote, as opposed to the capitalist mode of production. What follows is a portrait of this society after capital. The essay is divided into 6 short sections. The first touches on the conditions that give rise to the new society. The next 4 deal, respectively, with the new mode of production, its ownership relation, exchange relations, and the relations of allocation and distribution. The final section discusses the place of the individual in the new society. Conditions for communism. The conditions for the rise of communism are not given by nature. Communism is a product of history. Hence it is important to emphasize the singularity of the conditions presumed to give rise to communism, not least because this issue is very often neglected. In an early article, Marx wrote, quote, "Individuals build a new world from the historical achievements of their founding world," They must themselves, in the course of their development, first produce the material conditions of a new society, and no effort of spirit or will can free them from this destiny. End quote. Marx. Even with the strongest will and the greatest subjective effort, if the material conditions of production and the corresponding relations of circulation for a classless society do not exist in a latent form, quote, all attempts to explode the society would be Quixotism, end quote, Marx, in reference to Don Quixote. As we read in an early text, quote, if the material conditions of a total revolution are absent, the existing forces of production and the formation of a revolutionary mass which revolts not only against certain conditions of the past society, but against the, quote, old production of life, end quote, itself, and its foundation, the total activity on which it is based, then it does not matter at all for practical development that the idea of this revolution has already been formulated 100 times. End quote. Marx and Engels. The future society arises from the contradictions of the present society itself. The process is best understood by recalling two methodological principles, derived respectively from Spinoza and Hegel, which inform Marx's critique of political economy. In his first manuscript for Capital, Volume 2, Marx completed Spinoza's famous saying, quote, all determination is negation, end quote, by adding, quote, and all negation is determination, end quote. Years later, in his 1844 Parisian manuscripts, while critically commenting on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, Marx had observed that the latter's greatness lay in the, quote, dialectic of negativity as the moving and creating principle, end quote. Marx. Marx shows how capital creates the material and subjective conditions of its own negation, and simultaneously the elements of the new society that is destined to supersede it. The material conditions are a great increase in the productive forces which are developed to a high degree. This is, quote, a necessary practical presupposition, end quote, because without this high level of development, quote, only shortage will be generalized, and there will be a return of struggle around necessities, and with it, a return to the old misery, end quote. It is precisely capital's negative side which contributes to this positive outcome. Quote, the material and the spiritual conditions of the negation of wage labor and capital, themselves the negation of earlier forms of unfree social production, are in turn the result of capital's own process of production. End quote. Marx. It is only capital which, by separating the producers from the conditions of production, which are their own creation, and by pursuing the path of production for production's sake, the logic of accumulation, creates independently of the will of the individual capitalist an abundance of material wealth and the socialization of labor and production, which are the fundamental conditions for building the new society. In his 1847 discourse to the workers, Marx spoke of the big industries, free competition, and the world market as the, quote, positive side of capital, end quote, and added that, quote, without these relations of production, neither the means of production, the material means for the liberation of the proletariat and for founding a new society, could be created, nor could the proletariat take the road to union or undertake the necessary development enabling it to revolutionize society and itself. End quote. Marx. In an early 1860s manuscript referring to 10,000 miners killed in English coal mines in 10 years, Marx observed in his own English, quote, "Capitalist production is most economical of realized labor, labor realized in commodities. Capitalist production is a greater spendthrift than any other mode of production of man, of living labor, spendthrift not only of flesh and blood and muscles, but also of brains and nerves. It is in fact only with the greatest waste of individual development that the development of men is secured in those epochs of history which form the prelude to a socialist constitution of mankind." End quote. Marx. This same passage, almost word for word, appears in a later manuscript, that of Capital Volume 3. Marx argues that at a certain stage of capitalist development, its social relations of production turn into fetters on the further development of the forces of production, including the, quote, "greatest productive force," end quote, the working class itself. This indicates that the old capitalist society has reached the limits of its development, and that it is time for it to yield place to a new, higher social order. And this signals the beginning of the, quote, "epoch of social revolution." Marx. Quote, "The increasing unsuitability of the hitherto existing production relations of society for its productive development," end quote, writes Marx, is, quote, "expressed in sharp contradictions, crises, convulsions, the violent destruction of capital not through the relations external to it, but as the condition of its self-preservation, is the most striking form in which the advice is given to it to be gone and give room to a higher state of social production." End quote. Marx. In a famous, often misunderstood text, Marx emphasized, quote, "No social formation ever perishes before all the productive forces, which it is large enough to contain, have developed. And new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions have been hatched within the womb of the old society itself. That is why humanity always sets itself only the task which it can solve, and the task itself only appears where the material conditions of the task's solution already exist, or at least are in the process of formation." End quote. Marx. So far as the subjective conditions of its own negation are concerned, 2.5 decades later, in his polemic with Bakunin, Marx wrote, quote, "A radical social revolution is bound up with certain historical conditions of economic development. The latter are its preconditions. It is therefore only possible where, with capitalist development, the industrial proletariat occupies at least a significant position." End quote. In other words, in addition to the material conditions, a subjective spiritual condition was necessary, and this again was provided by capital itself, which begat its, quote, "own gravedigger," end quote, in the form of the proletariat. It must be stressed that capitalist relations are not revolutionized within capitalism automatically. even with all the requisite material conditions prepared by capital itself. It is the proletariat's, quote, categorical imperative to overthrow all the relations in which the individual is a degraded, enslaved, abandoned, despised being, end quote. It is the working class, the, quote, greatest productive force, end quote, which is the active agent for eliminating capital and building communist society. Marx emphasizes that it is the proletariat whose, quote, historical mission is to revolutionize the capitalist mode of production and to abolish classes, end quote. As their justification of this mission, Marx and Engels had already written more than 4 decades earlier, quote, the conditions of existence of the proletariat subsume all the conditions of the present society, which have reached a paroxysm of inhumanity. In the proletariat, the human individual has lost herself, but has at the same time gained the theoretical consciousness of this loss. The proletariat feels itself constrained to revolt directly against this humanity. It is for these reasons that the proletariat can and must liberate itself, but it cannot liberate itself without abolishing its own conditions of existence. It cannot abolish its own conditions of existence without abolishing all the inhuman conditions of the present society which are subsumed in its own situation, end quote. The proletariat is the, quote, bad side of the present society, and, quote, history moves by the bad side, end quote, as Marx reminded Proudhon in 1847, about a year earlier. Marx and Engels had underlined that the quote, consciousness of the necessity of a profound revolution, the communist revolution, arises from this class itself, end quote. Indeed, quote, the proletariat is either revolutionary or it is nothing, end quote. As Marx wrote to a friend many years later in 1865, the proletarian revolution is an act of self-emancipation, quote, the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves, end quote. At the same time, since the proletariat was the lowest class in capitalist society, Marx and Engels stressed the emancipation of the proletariat signifies at the same time the emancipation of humanity itself. It is important to note the specificity of the proletarian revolution, as Marx and Engels underline. Unlike the bourgeoisie, which started to undermine the pre-capitalist relations of production long before attaining political domination, the proletariat must first have its own political power in order to start the transformation process. From this point onward, begins the process of revolutionizing the bourgeois mode of production, and it continues till the whole existing mode of production is transformed. This is what Marx called the, quote, revolutionary transformation period, end quote, between capitalism and communism, dominated by working class rule, which begins with the destruction of the existing bourgeois state machinery and installs proletarian rule. The, quote, rule of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority, end quote. Far from signifying the victory of the revolution, however, this constitutes only the, quote, first step in the revolution. It is during this prolonged, quote, transition period that the whole capitalist mode of production, and therewith the whole with the whole bourgeois social order are superseded. Until capital totally disappears, the workers do not cease to be proletarians, and hence, quote, the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, as Marx calls it, continues throughout the, quote, transition period, end quote, the period of preparation for the workers' self-emancipation. Marx characterizes this period as the, quote, prolonged birth pangs, end quote, within the womb of the capitalist society. At the end of the process, with the end of the capitalist mode of production, wage labor also naturally disappears. The proletariat, together with its political rules, ceases to exist, leaving individuals as simple producers. Classes come to an end along with private property and the state, the embodiments of class domination and oppression. At this point, all political power will cease to exist, since political power is the official expression of the antagonism in civil society. We read in the programmatic part of the Communist Manifesto that while all the instruments of production are, quote, centralized in the hands of the state in the beginning, end quote, it is only, quote, in the hands of the associated individuals and public power. It is only, skip the line. We read in the programmatic part of the Communist Manifesto that while all the instruments of production are, quote, centralized in the hands of the state in the beginning, end quote, it is only, quote, in the course of development that class distinctions disappear. All production is concentrated in the hands of the associated individuals, and public power loses its political character. The proletariat abolishes the old relations of production, and thereby its own rule as a class, end quote. Marx and Engels. Engels put it later, in place of the rule over persons, there will be administration of things and the direction of the processes of production. The state will not be abolished, it will pass away. The associated mode of production. The outcome of the workers' revolution is a communist society based on the associated mode of production and corresponding relations of production. This is, quote, a reunion, end quote, or a, quote, association of, quote, free individuals. The expression, quote, free individuals, here signifies individuals who are neither under personal dependence as in slavery or serfdom, nor subject to material dependence as in commodity production. The term, quote, reunion or, quote, association has a double sense. On the one hand, it contrasts with capitalism's separation of individual producers one from another, and on the other, it contrasts with the separation of producers as a whole from the conditions of production. Rather, it denotes a voluntary, unmediated association of individuals as producers who have now ceased to be proletarians, plus a union of the producers and their conditions of production. This, quote, union, the exact opposite of capitalism's separation, is not a constrained union, such as exists under slavery or serfdom, nor is it voluntary union such as might exist under, quote, natural communism or in a small family enterprise. Rather, it is built, quote, on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, end quote. Marx. Having ceased to be proletarians, labor loses its earlier meaning, for it is no longer commanded and enforced by an alien power on the laborer. Labor now is transformed into free and conscious self-activity exercised by the individual producer as part of the free association. It's a stupid voice directed towards the development of the individual's human essence. Thus, in the new society, we have the complete de-alienation as opposed to capitalism's alienation of individuals, both in regard to their own kind and to their own material creations, as opposed to a hitherto existing, quote, false community, end quote, which as an autonomous power confronted and subjected the singular individual. There is now a, quote, true community whose members are universally developed social individuals subjecting their social relations to their own control. The ownership relation. For Marx, the ownership relations are simply the juridical expression of relations of production, so that a change in the relations of production ownership relations must necessarily change. Ownership, however, refers to the ownership of the means of production and means of labor. In all class societies, this ownership is belonged to a small minority, excluding the great majority from real ownership. While in pre-capitalist societies, the laboring people, mostly slaves and serfs and their like, were considered an integral part of the means of production, under capital, wage and salary earners are completely separated from these means. In his sixth notebook of 1861 to 63, Marx calls this form of class ownership, which is not recognized by jurisprudence, quote, ownership of a definite class, end quote, or, quote, private ownership of a part of society, end quote. This is analytically a distinct issue from the question of ownership by individual capitalists in their private capacity. Indeed, within Marx's broad category of class ownership, there could be different forms of private ownership. In modern jurisprudence, private ownership refers to the ownership of means of production by an individual/household or by a business enterprise. Quite understandably, the substitution of this form of private ownership by public state ownership is considered as the abolition of private ownership in the means of production. However, for Marx, this is to confuse the form of ownership with the relation of ownership, which for Marx is the juridical expression of the production relations of society. For Marx, the capitalist ownership relation derives directly from the capitalist relations of production and is defined by the producer's separation from the means of production. This ownership relation may take different forms, such as ownership of the individual capitalist or of, quote, associated capitalists, joint stock company, or even of the state. Thus, state ownership of the means of production does not signify the end of, quote, private ownership of a part of society, end quote, namely, class ownership of the means of production, so long as the great majority, separated from the means of production, remain wage and salary earners. It simply signifies the end of the juridically recognized individual, including corporate private ownership of the means of production. Indeed, the Communist Manifesto makes clear that the juridical elimination of individual private ownership of the means of production and their concentration of the ownership of the proletarian political power is only a beginning measure of the revolution. And since the installation of workers' political power does not entail the immediate disappearance of capital as a relation of production, proletarian state ownership does not mean the end of, quote, class private ownership, end quote, in the means of production. As Marx stresses, a society cannot simply jump over or, quote, enact away its natural phases of development. Quote, class private ownership, end quote, will disappear only with the disappearance of capitalist relations themselves, along with the proletarian state. Capitalist private ownership of means of production, both in its individual and class sense, then yield place to ownership by society as a whole, namely social appropriation, as Marx and Engels stress, quote, with the appropriation of the associated individuals of the totality of the produce, as Marx and Engels stress, quote, with the appropriation by the associated individuals of the totality of the productive forces, private ownership disappears, end quote, Marx and Engels. This appropriation, contrary to its earlier forms, which had a limited character, has now a universal character. This is partly because it reverses the situation in which the great majority were excluded from ownership of the means of production, and partly because, given the universal character of the development of the productive forces contained under capital, the appropriation of the productive forces has also to be a universal appropriation by the collective body of the emancipated producers. And because the integral individual is a social individual, former private ownership is transformed into something akin to, quote, individual ownership. Almost paraphrasing the language of capital, Marx observes in his discourse on the Paris Commune that, quote, It aimed at the expropriation of the expropriators. It wanted to make individual property a truth by transforming the means of production into mere instruments of free and associated labor. This is communism, end quote, Marx. Exchange relations. Like the ownership relation, exchange relations also change following the transformation of social relations of production. As in earlier societies, the two types of exchange carried on by humans, namely material exchange with nature and social exchange among themselves, continue to operate in communism. As regards the material exchange of individuals with nature, the capitalist mode of production, compared with earlier modes of production, renders humans less dependent on nature by progressively subjecting nature to human intelligence through an unprecedented increase in the material forces of production. Its technology at the same time seriously damages the natural environment by undermining the natural powers of the earth along with those of the human producer, the twin foundations of all wealth. Under the associated mode of production, social individuals not only free themselves from subjugation to nature's blind force through a rational regulation of their material exchanges with nature, but also carry on these exchanges in conditions, quote, most worthy of and in fullest conformity with their human nature, end quote. Coming to exchange relations among individuals, it should be noted that in any society, individuals create useful objects for one another so that exchange has a social character. However, in a society with generalized commodity production, where products from private labor are carried out in reciprocal independence, the social character of this process is not established directly. Rather, it has to be mediated by exchanging products as commodities. The social relations of individuals take the form of social relations of their products. Products dominate the producers and confront the producers as an independent power. Marx considers the whole process as a process of mystification and famously names it, quote, commodity fetishism, end quote, in Capital. In the association, the social collective character of production is presupposed, and therefore individual labor is directly social from the beginning. In place of the exchange of products, which assumes a value form, there is now, quote, free exchange of activities, end quote, among social individuals, quote, determined by collective social needs and aims, end quote. Under Capital, the social character of production is posited only post festum, only after the products are promoted to the rank of exchange value. As Marx stresses in his 1857 to 1858 manuscripts in Communism, quote, community is posited before production, end quote. End quote, the individual's participation in the world of collective products is not mediated by independent labors or products of labor. It is mediated by the social conditions of production within which the individual's activity is asserted. Later, Engels observed that, quote, as soon as society takes possession of the means of production and employs them towards directly socialized production, the labor of everybody, however different its useful character, is from the beginning directly social labor. How much social labor is contained in a product could be known directly without going through a detour of exchange value, end quote, Engels. Distribution/allocation. Distribution in any society can be viewed both as the distribution of the conditions of production and as the distribution of products, with the former determining the latter. The distribution of the conditions of production includes the distribution of the material means of production and of laboring individuals across different branches of production. It is, in fact, the distribution of the total social labor time, dead as well as living, across the economy. Thus viewed, the distribution of conditions of production is, quote, a moment of production, end quote, itself, or an aspect of the mode of production itself. The regulation of production by a proper distribution of society's available labor time across different productive spheres is common to all societies. In general, there is an absolute need to economize society's global time for production, not only in the interest of efficiency, but also in order to release more time to allow individuals personal enjoyment and development. Thus, quote, all economy is finally reduced to the economy of time, end quote. However, in a society based on conscious collective production, the economy of time and the social distribution of time assume such a different character that they constitute the, quote, first economic law, end quote, of the society of associated producers. Whereas under capital, the distribution of society's labor time is mediated by the value form of the products of labor, the new society solves the problem in a, quote, conscious, controlled way, end quote, without the need for social relations to appear as relations between things, as Marx explained in his 1868 letter to friends. So far as the social allocation of labor time is concerned, there are two particular situations that all economies face. The first concerns the replacement of the means of production that perish or wear out over a period, whereas capitalism, quote, solves this problem anarchically. The solution lies in, quote, continuous relative overproduction, end quote, of the means of production, possible only when society consciously controls and plans the process of its own reproduction, as in communism. The second problem relates to the temporal lag between employment of resources and obtaining the use values from them. This lag is long in some lines of production and relatively short in others. This again is a situation independent of any specific mode of production. The problem of allocating resources to production lines with a longer time lag, compared with others with a shorter time lag, is, quote, solved in the capitalist mode of production post festum and at the cost of abiding disturbances. While in the associated mode of production, society will consciously calculate and plan in advance the necessary scale of operation and allocate the resources, that is, the total labor time, accordingly. Marx observes that from a purely objective point of view, the necessity of such calculation increases with the growing social character of production, for example, in capitalism compared with simple commodity production. Given that communism is at a still higher scale of socialization, and that it is a consciously planned economy, the necessity of such calculation, social bookkeeping, is even greater. Not only is the allocation of labor time between different lines of production affected in a different way under the associated mode of production than under the capitalist mode of production, the saving of the global labor time devoted to production takes on an altogether different character. In all social classes, the minimization of global labor time leads to an increase in the non-labor time of the non-producing few. However, the capitalist mode of production continuously strives to increase the surplus labor time of the workers. In other words, the labor of the worker beyond her/his own needs, which the capitalist appropriates in the name of society. The surplus value is the basis of society's free time. However, the capitalist mode of production continuously strives to increase the surplus labor time of the workers. In other words, the labor of the worker beyond that worker's own needs, which the capitalist appropriates in the name of society. The surplus labor is the basis of society's free time and simultaneously the material basis of society's many-sided development. But whereas under capitalism, disposable time is converted into surplus time, leading ultimately to the crisis of overproduction and non-valorization of surplus labor. In the associated mode of production, the social appropriation of the conditions of production means that the distinction between necessary and surplus labor time loses its significance. For necessary labor time is now measured in terms of needs of the, quote, social individual, not in terms of the needs of valorization. Similarly, the increase in disposable time no longer signifies non-labor time for the few. The increase in disposable time is disposable or free time for all, quote, social individuals, and society's free time now becomes the measure of society's wealth in a double sense. First, labor time produces more and more wealth due to the immense increase in the productive forces, which are unconstrained by earlier contradictions or by the enrichment of the few. Second, free time signifies wealth in an unusual sense because it means the enjoyment of different kinds of creation and because it means free activity, which, unlike labor time, is not determined by any external finality that has to be satisfied as a natural necessity or as a social obligation. On the other hand, labor time itself, the basis of free time, now acquires a new significance. Labor is now directly social, unmediated hierarchically, or by the value form of the product of labor, and bereft of its earlier antagonistic form. There is another important aspect of distribution under communism which concerns the division of total social product between society's production and consumption needs, as well as the distribution of the means of consumption among the social individuals. As to the first problem, one part of the social product serves as common funds that include replacement and extension of society's productive apparatus, as well as society's insurance and reserve funds against uncertainty. The rest serve as the means of collective consumption, namely society's health and educational needs, and provision for those who are unable to work, and personal consumption. As regards the mode of distribution of the means of consumption among individual producers, this follows from the way in which the conditions of production are distributed. As producers are reunited with the conditions of production under communism, producers are no longer sellers of their labor power, and the wage form of reward for their labor ceases. Now the producers receive from their own association not a wage but some kind of token, indicating the labor time that each individual has contributed to the total social labor time after deduction for the common funds. These tokens allow the producers to draw from the social stock of means of consumption an amount equivalent to their labor. Naturally, in the absence of commodity production, these tokens are not money, they do not circulate. In the initial phase of communist society, still afflicted with the birthmarks of the old order, the principle of equal exchange, that is, equivalent exchange of labor against labor of the same amount, cannot be avoided. Quote, bourgeois right still operates, albeit with a big difference. Whereas in the old society, the principle of exchange of equivalents can exist only as an average, i.e., it cannot exist for each individual case, since it is unascertainable. Under social appropriation, the opposite is true. With directly social labor, the share of each producer in total social labor time is evident. Hence, there is no contradiction between principle and practice. The unavoidable persistence of this, quote, bourgeois right at the initial stage of the association is wholly overcome only at a higher stage of the association, when an all-round development of the, quote, social individual, along with the development of the productive forces, takes place and when all the springs of cooperative wealth, quote, cooperative wealth, flow more fully. Only then will prevail the principle, quote, from each according to one's ability, to each according to one's needs, end quote. Marx. The laboring individual under communism. In 1845, Marx defined his and Engels' quote, new materialism thus, quote, the standpoint of the old materialism is civil society. The standpoint of the new materialism is the human society, or social humanity, end quote. Yet not much attention has been paid to their thinking on the situation of the individual under communism. Quite early, Marx set the tone, quote, all emancipation is the reduction of the human world and relationships to the human individual, her, himself, end quote. Later, in a justly famous statement, Marx and Engels affirmed that in the association, the, quote, free development of each, end quote, would be the, quote, condition for the free development of all, end quote. Engels later held, quote, it is self-evident that society cannot liberate itself without liberating each individual, end quote. Marx particularly focuses on the situation of the producing individual in the association. Quote, the relations of personal dependence are the first social forms in the midst of which the human productivity develops, but only in reduced proportions and in isolated places. Personal independence based on material dependence is the second great form within which is constituted a system of general social metabolism made of universal relations, faculties, and needs. Free individuality, based on the universal development of individuals and their domination of their common social productivity as their own social power, is the third stage, end quote. Three stages here refer respectively to pre-capitalism, capitalism, and communism. Here Marx makes a very important distinction between an individual's labor as such and an individual's labor as self-activity, a distinction which most of his readers leave aside. The neglect of this point leads to a wrong understanding of Marx's emphasis in some texts on the abolition of the division of labor and of labor itself in the coming society. This position appears most explicitly in the German ideology of 1846. At first sight it looks strange. Even many Marxists are embarrassed by this seemingly, quote, utopian idea. Let us look at the matter more closely. Basically, Marx stresses that the labor as it has been practiced by human individuals in society so far has been principally involuntary, at the service of others, commanded by others. This was palpably the case with individuals under, quote, personal dependence, as seen in slavery and serfdom, in their different forms. Under, quote, material dependence, namely with wage labor, this is less palpable, but here too an individual's labor is imposed on the laborer by forces external to him. Labor under capital, as we saw earlier, remains alienated from the laborer. Quote, the laborer finds himself in the same relation to his product as to an alienated object. In this labor, the laborer does not affirm but negates himself. The laborer has the feeling of being himself only outside of labor, and outside of himself in labor. His labor is not voluntarily given, it is imposed. It is forced labor. End quote. 1 year later, in 1845, in his critique of Friedrich List, Marx remarks that the laborer's activity, is not, quote, a free manifestation of his human life. It is rather an alienation of his powers to capital, end quote. Marx calls such activity labor, and writes that, quote, labor by nature is unfree, inhuman activity, end quote, and calls for the, quote, abolition of labor. Indeed, Marx cites Adam Smith's view that labor in history so far, including labor under capital, has been repulsive, appearing as sacrifice, as externally enforced labor, and that non-labor is freedom and luck. As regards the existing division of labor, Marx underlines that the activity of the individual here is not voluntary. As soon as the labor begins to be divided, each laboring individual has a definite exclusive circle of activity imposed on him from which she cannot escape. Referring to the division of labor in capitalism, Marx says that this process affects not only the economic sphere, but also other spheres, introducing everywhere the process of, quote, parcelization of the laboring individual, end quote. Marx also calls such individuals, quote, details. That is, quote, fragmented individuals. I've never heard that before. Marx referring to individuals within capitalism as details, but I like that. Very poetic. Very pertinently, he cites what he calls the, quote, outcry of Adam Smith's teacher, Adam Ferguson. Quote, we make a nation of helots, serfs in ancient Sparta. We have no free citizens, end quote. Adam Ferguson. Hence the task of the, quote, communist revolution is a question of abolishing existing labor and the existing division of labor. This is the sense we get in Marx's critique of the Gotha program of 1875. Discussing the lower and higher phases of communist society, Marx observes that the lower phases of the new society cannot completely get rid of the legacy of the mode of labor of the old society, including the division of labor, particularly that between mental and physical labor. Only the higher phase of the new society will completely transcend the narrow bourgeois horizon, when labor will not simply be a means of life, but will become life's first need. Not all division of labor will be abolished, but only the division of labor which, quote, puts the individual under its enslaving subordination, end quote, along with the opposition between mental and physical labor. Earlier, we discussed the relationship between the necessary and surplus labor time in the perspective of the associated mode of production as opposed to the capitalist mode of production. Now we focus on this distinction specifically from the perspective of the laboring individual. In all modes of production, necessary labor is what is required for preserving and reproducing labor power, while surplus labor is labor beyond necessary labor, whose product takes the form of surplus value in capitalism. Once the capitalist form of production disappears, a part of total human activity still remains necessary, in the early sense of preserving and reproducing the labor power of the individual laborer through the division for collective and individual consumption. Once the capitalist form of production disappears, a part of total human activity will remain necessary in the earlier sense of preserving and reproducing the labor power of the individual through the provisions for collective and individual consumption, including food, housing, health, and education. However, in contrast to capitalism, the domain of necessary labor is much further extended in conformity with the requirements of the total development of the individual, subject only to the limits set by society's productive powers. The labor beyond this necessary labor, the surplus labor, which under capitalism used to serve mainly capital accumulation, disappears. On the other hand, a part of what is considered under capitalism as surplus labor, the part which today serves as reserve and accumulation funds, would, in the absence of capital, be counted as necessary labor for insurance and reserve funds. It would also be counted in the continuing enlarged reproduction of the means of production, keeping pace no longer with the requirements of capital accumulation, but with the requirements of the growing social needs of the associated individuals, including provision for those not in a position to work. So the entire labor devoted to material production is counted as necessary under communism. The time beyond this necessary labor time required for material production is free time. Disposable, time for enjoying the products and for free activity. In a justly famous passage, Marx observes, quote, "The kingdom of freedom begins where the kingdom determined by necessity and external expediency ceases. It lies, therefore, in the nature of things beyond the sphere of material production, properly speaking, just as the savage has to wrestle with nature in order to satisfy his needs, to preserve his life, and to reproduce the civilized person also must do the same in all social forms and under all possible modes of production. With his development increases this kingdom of natural necessity because his needs increase. But at the same time, the productive powers increase to satisfy them. Only beyond this begins the development of human powers as an end in itself, the true freedom, which, however, can bloom only on the basis of the other kingdom, that of necessity." End quote. Marx. It is important to note that Engels, while treating the relation between freedom and necessity with regard to communism, as opposed to earlier class societies, comes to a conclusion somewhat different from Marx's. For Engels, communism constitutes, quote, "humanity's leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom," end quote. Even the non-disposable or necessary labor time in communism has a qualitatively different character from the necessary labor time in a class society, inasmuch as this time is not imposed by an alien power, but is willingly undertaken by the associated producers as self-activity, as self-affirmation. It seems that when Marx was speaking of labor not only as a means of life, but as life's first need in the critique of the Gotha program, and earlier in his inaugural address to the First International, distinguishing between labor in the past and, quote, associated labor, plying its toil with a willing hand, a ready mind, and a joyous heart, end quote. He was precisely referring to, quote, necessary labor, end quote, in communism, in the sphere of material production. As regards the necessary labor time dedicated to material production itself, under communism, the continuous development of productive forces at a high rate, helped by advancing science and technology, would allow a continuous decrease of necessary labor time and a corresponding decrease of disposable, that is, free time for every individual. Quote, true wealth is the developed productive power of all individuals. It is no more the labor time, but the disposable time which is the measure of wealth. Labor time as the measure of wealth assumes wealth is founded on poverty. Labor time as the measure of wealth posits the whole time of an individual as labor time, and thus degrades the individual to the position of simple laborer, subsumed under labor. Marx refers to the idea of the ancients, that the aim of production is the human individual, and considers this as, quote, sublime, compared to the modern world where the aim of humans is production, and the aim of production is wealth, and not the human individual. Then Marx adds, quote, once the limited bourgeois form disappears, wealth appears as nothing but the universality of needs, of capacities, of enjoyments, productive powers of the individual. The absolute elaboration of the individual's creative aptitudes, with no other presupposition but the previous historical development, which makes an end in itself the totality of development of all human powers as such, not measured by a standard previously set. The individual is not reproduced according to a particular determinacy, but creates his totality. In bourgeois economy and the corresponding epoch of production, this complete elaboration of human interiority appears as complete emptiness. End quote, Marx. In consonance with the three-stage analysis of the situation of the individual given above, Marx discusses in English the changing relations through time of what he calls the man of labor and the means of labor in his 1865 discourse to the workers of the International. The, quote, original union, then its, quote, decomposition, and finally the, quote, restoration of the original union in a new historical form, end quote. Here the last form refers to communism, where through the appropriation of the, quote, means of labor by the collective body of the freely associated individuals, the reunion takes place. Once this reunion is established, the human individual ceases to be personally or materially dependent, to exist as an alienated, parcelized, fragmented individual, and becomes a totally developed, integral individual. This, quote, free individuality signifies the, quote, real appropriation of the human essence by the human for the human, a conscious return to the human essence, conserving all the wealth of previous development. End quote. Marx. With this begins humanity's real history, leaving in Marx's celebrated phrase, quote, the prehistory of human society, end quote, behind. Communism is thus the beginning, not the end of human history.